Story 1. Man in the red suit. He was sitting on my bed when I came out of the bathroom. A man in an elegant red suit, perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, staring at the wall with hollow eyes that reflected no light. I froze in the doorway, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would crack a rib. He did not move, did not acknowledge my presence, just sat there like a wax figure, impossibly present in my locked hotel room at the Fairmont Empress, one of the most beautiful and terrifying places I have ever stayed. The Fairmont Empress sits on the inner harbor of Victoria, British Columbia, a grand castle-like hotel that has hosted royalty, celebrities, and countless guests since opening in 1908. It is famous for its afternoon tea, its ivy-covered walls, its old-world elegance. But ask the staff about the man in the red suit, and you will see their expressions change. Some will deny knowing anything. Others will quietly admit they have seen him too. All of them will tell you the same thing. He is harmless. He just appears, and there is nothing anyone can do to stop him. I am a travel writer specializing in historic hotels. I have stayed in hundreds of old buildings across North America, heard every ghost story, experienced countless creaky floorboards and drafty windows that guests mistake for paranormal activity. I approach these stories with professional skepticism. But what happened to me during 3 nights at the Fairmont Empress shattered every rational explanation I had built over 20 years of travel writing. The hotel gave me room 417, a corner suite with views of the harbor and the Parliament buildings. Beautiful room, high ceilings, antique furniture, that perfect blend of historic charm and modern comfort. The bellhop who brought up my luggage seemed nervous, rushing through his explanation of the room, its features. When I tipped him, he hesitated at the door, opened his mouth as if to say something, then simply nodded and left. That should have been my first warning. The first night passed without incident. I worked on my laptop, reviewed notes, took photographs of the room, its period details. Around midnight, I noticed the temperature had dropped significantly. Not gradually, suddenly. One moment I was comfortable in a t-shirt. The next I was shivering, my breath visible in the air. I checked the thermostat. It showed 72 degrees. But the room felt like a freezer. Then I smelled it, pipe tobacco, rich, aromatic pipe smoke filling the room despite the no smoking policy and the fact that my windows were closed. The scent was strong, fresh, as if someone was sitting in the corner puffing away. I searched every inch of the suite. Nothing, no source, but the smell persisted for almost an hour before gradually fading. The temperature returned to normal. I convinced myself it was ventilation from another room, some quirk of the old building systems. The second night, he appeared. I had just finished brushing my teeth, dressed for bed, planning to read for a while before sleeping. When I stepped out of the bathroom, there he was, sitting on the edge of my bed, wearing that immaculate red suit, the kind of formal attire you might see in photographs from the 1920s. His hair was slicked back, his posture was perfect, and his face was the most disturbing thing I have ever seen. He looked normal at first glance. Middle-aged, handsome in that distinguished way. But his skin had a waxy quality, like a department store mannequin. And his eyes, though open and seemingly focused on something across the room, held no life. No spark of consciousness. He was there, physically present, but somehow absent, like looking at a projection of a person rather than an actual human being. I tried to speak, my voice caught in my throat. I tried to move, my legs would not respond. I stood frozen in the bathroom doorway, watching this impossible figure sit on my bed, wondering if I was having a stroke or if my mind had finally broken under the stress of too much travel and too little sleep. But this was not a hallucination. This was real. He was real. I could see the slight depression in the mattress where he sat. I could see the fabric of his suit catching the lamplight. I could smell that pipe tobacco again, stronger now, overwhelming. Then he turned his head, slowly, deliberately, until those dead eyes were looking directly at me. His lips moved, forming words I could not hear. No sound emerged, but I understood somehow. He was saying my name, over and over, calling to me with silent words and that terrible, empty gaze. I do not remember moving, but I found myself in the hallway, the door slamming behind me, my heart trying to escape through my chest. I stood there in my pajamas, gasping for breath, while other guests walked past, glancing at me with concern. I forced myself to calm down, to think rationally. I was a professional. I had seen weird things in old hotels before. This was just another story for the article. Just another piece of local color. I waited 10 minutes before opening the door. The room was empty. The bed showed no sign of disturbance beyond where I had been sitting earlier. The temperature was normal, the smell was gone, but something felt different, changed, as if his presence had left an imprint on the space, a residual heaviness that pressed against my chest and made breathing difficult. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window, lights on, laptop open, researching. That is when I found the stories. Dozens of reports spanning decades. Guests who had seen the man in the red suit. Always in different rooms. Always sitting on the bed. Always that same silent, haunting presence. Some guests checked out immediately. Others, like me, tried to rationalize it, but everyone agreed on the details. The red suit, the waxy skin, the dead eyes, the feeling of being watched by something that was no longer quite human. The hotel staff, when pressed by journalists over the years, admitted they knew about him. He had been appearing since at least the 1950s, though some elderly employees claimed the sightings went back to the hotel's earliest days. No one knew who he was. No records existed of anyone dying in the hotel while wearing a red suit. No tragic accident. No murder. No explanation for why this particular ghost, if that is what he was, chose to manifest in this way. But here's the truly disturbing part. He does not just appear randomly. There is a pattern. Guests who see him share certain characteristics. They are always alone, always staying for work or personal reasons that involve some kind of loss or transition. Divorce, job loss, death in the family. As if he is drawn to people experiencing emotional vulnerability. As if he feeds on it somehow, or offers some kind of terrible comfort that no living person could understand. I fit that profile perfectly. My marriage had ended 6 months earlier. I was traveling constantly, avoiding my empty house, burying myself in work to escape the grief. And somehow, he knew. He had chosen me, appeared to me, sat on my bed and silently called my name with those awful, lightless eyes. The third night, I almost left. I stood in the lobby with my packed bags, ready to check out early and drive to another city. But something stopped me. Pride, maybe, or morbid curiosity, or the writer's instinct that this was the story of a lifetime if I could just survive long enough to tell it. I went back to room 417. I prepared myself mentally for whatever might happen. And I waited. He appeared at exactly 2:17 in the morning, the same time he had vanished the previous night. This time he was standing by the window, his back to me, looking out at the harbor. The moonlight passed through him, as if he was only partially solid. As if reality could not quite hold him in place. I watched him stand there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then he turned, looked at me, and smiled. That smile was the most horrifying thing I have ever witnessed. It was not cruel or menacing. It was sad, deeply, impossibly sad, as if he was trying to communicate something he could no longer put into words. Some terrible truth about existence that living people were not meant to understand. His lips moved again, forming silent words, but this time I understood them clearly, as if he was speaking directly into my mind. He was saying he was sorry. So sorry. For what? I did not know. For appearing? For frightening me? Or for something else entirely? Then he was gone. Not fading, not walking away, just gone. The room felt lighter immediately, as if an enormous weight had been lifted. But I was changed. Something in me had shifted during that encounter. I understood, on some level one cannot fully articulate, that I had glimpsed something beyond the normal world. Something that exists in the spaces between life and death. Something that is trapped and cannot move forward. I checked out the next morning. The staff asked if I had enjoyed my stay. I said yes, because what else could I say? That I had spent 3 nights being visited by a ghost in a red suit? That I had looked into the eyes of something that was no longer human and seen my own future sadness reflected there? They would have smiled politely and marked me down as another unstable guest who could not handle the hotel's history. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that the man in the red suit is still there, appearing to guests who are vulnerable, who are suffering, who are open to his particular brand of terrible comfort. The hotel will never acknowledge him officially. They cannot afford to scare away guests. But he is as much a part of the Fairmont Empress as the ivy on the walls or the tea service in the afternoon. I have researched every possible explanation. Shared hallucination, mass hysteria, elaborate prank by the staff. None of it fits. Too many witnesses. Too many consistent details across decades. Too many people who have no reason to lie, no connection to each other, all reporting the same experience. The man in the red suit is real, whatever that means. However that is possible. He exists. The question that haunts me, The question I cannot answer is why. Why does he appear? What does he want? Is he trying to warn people? To comfort them? To steal something from them? Or is he simply trapped, repeating some action from his life, unable to move beyond whatever moment claimed him? I have not returned to the Fairmont Empress. I have written about dozens of other historic hotels, documented their ghosts and legends and colorful histories. But I cannot bring myself to go back there, because I know if I do, if I stay in room 417 or any of the other rooms where he has been seen, he will appear again. He will sit on my bed or stand by my window, and he will look at me with those dead, sorrowful eyes, and I will understand a little more of whatever terrible truth he carries. And I am not sure I can survive that understanding. The Fairmont Empress is still open. You can book a room there right now. You can stay in their beautiful suites, drink their famous tea, enjoy their impeccable service. And if you are unlucky, if you fit his profile, if you are vulnerable in the way that attracts his attention, you might see him too. The man in the red suit, sitting on your bed, calling your name in silence, offering whatever sad comfort a ghost can provide. So here's my question for you. If you had the opportunity to stay in a room where he is known to appear, would you do it? Would you risk that encounter for the chance to experience something truly paranormal? Or would you choose another hotel, another room, another city entirely, trusting your instincts that some mysteries are better left unexplored? Write your answer in the comments, because somewhere in Victoria, British Columbia, in a beautiful hotel overlooking the harbor, a man in a red suit is waiting. And he might be waiting for you. Story 2. Ice Mummies. What the glaciers are revealing. I found a perfectly preserved hand reaching up through the ice, and it was moving. That's where I need to start this confession. That's the exact moment when I realized that something deeply wrong was happening in the Rocky Mountains. My name is Christopher, and I am a professional mountain guide who has spent the last 15 years leading climbers through the peaks of Colorado and Wyoming. I've hiked hundreds of times through terrain that most people will never see. I thought I understood the mountains. I thought I knew what to expect from this landscape. I was completely, terrifyingly wrong. The summer of this year was unusual. The heat was intense. Record-breaking temperatures were melting the glaciers at rates that alarmed even the most experienced mountaineers and climate scientists. The ice that had persisted for decades, sometimes for centuries, was disappearing rapidly. And as the glaciers receded and the ice retreated, they began revealing something that had been frozen and hidden for a very long time. They were revealing bodies. The first discovery happened in late June. A group of climbers found skeletal remains emerging from a glacier on Mount Robson. The remains were perfectly preserved, frozen in time. The bones were intact, the clothing was recognizable, and according to archival records, the person had been missing since 1987. The discovery was eerie and significant, but not entirely surprising. Everyone knew that people had died in the mountains over the decades. Everyone understood that bodies sometimes became trapped in glacial ice. What was surprising was how many bodies started appearing. By July, search and rescue teams had discovered 5 different sets of remains emerging from various glaciers throughout the Rocky Mountain range. By August, the number had climbed to 17. By September, there were 43 documented ice mummies. The glaciers were literally giving up their dead. Decades of hidden tragedy were being exposed as the ice melted and released its frozen secrets. The media coverage was intense and sensational. News crews came to document the discoveries. Scientists arrived to study the phenomenon. The mountains, which had always felt remote and isolated, suddenly became the focus of national attention. Every new body became a story. Every set of remains became an opportunity for news outlets to explore the mystery and danger of mountain climbing. I was hired as a guide to help teams access some of the glacier sites. I was asked to lead people to places where bodies were being discovered, to help with documentation and recovery efforts. I told myself it was important work. I told myself that helping families find closure was meaningful. I ignored my growing sense of unease about what was actually happening in these mountains. The first body I personally encountered was on a glacier near Peak 10. The team I was leading included 2 search and rescue professionals and a documentary filmmaker who was recording the experience. We hiked up to the glacier in the early morning, when the air was still cold and the ice was more stable. And there, protruding from the melting glacier face, was a human torso. The body was in an advanced state of preservation. The clothing was from the 1970s. The skin, what remained of it, was darkened and hardened by decades of freezing and desiccation. The face was partially exposed, frozen in an expression of profound fear and suffering. The creepy reality was that this person had been lying in this glacier since before I was born. This person had been trapped in ice for almost 50 years. The search and rescue team carefully excavated the body. They documented everything. They collected artifacts that might help with identification. And I stood there, watching this process, feeling something unsettling and eerie growing in my mind. Something that I couldn't quite articulate. That night, back at the base camp, I mentioned my strange feeling to one of the search and rescue professionals. I told her that something about the bodies didn't feel right. That something about the way they were emerging from the glaciers seemed almost deliberate. Almost intentional. She laughed and told me I was reading too much into the situation. She told me that the bodies were simply being revealed through normal glacial processes. She told me that the unseasonably warm weather was accelerating the usual timeline of exposure. She told me that my imagination was creating patterns where none existed. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I couldn't escape the growing sense that something terrifying was happening in these mountains. Over the next few weeks, I guided multiple teams to multiple glacier sites. I witnessed the recovery of dozens of bodies, and with each discovery, a pattern began to emerge, a horrifying, deeply disturbing pattern that nobody else seemed to be noticing. The bodies weren't scattered randomly across the glaciers. They were arranged, positioned, organized in a way that suggested intentional placement. Some bodies were facing downward. Some were facing upward toward the sky. Some were positioned in groups, as if they had been placed together deliberately. The arrangement couldn't be explained by normal glacial dynamics or by random freezing processes. And then there was the issue of the ice itself. The glacier face where the bodies were emerging had a disturbing quality. The ice looked wrong. It had colors and patterns that I had never seen in glacial ice before. There were veins of dark material running through it, like something was embedded within the frozen water. There were circular patterns, almost like eyes, that seemed to be watching as the bodies were exposed. Most disturbing of all, some areas of the glacier were warm. Unnaturally warm. I would touch the ice and it would feel almost human, almost like living skin. The other guides didn't seem to notice this. When I mentioned it to them, they would touch the same spot and tell me it was cold. But I could feel the heat. I could feel the warmth radiating from within the glacier itself. I started researching the history of the missing climbers and hikers whose remains were being discovered. I wanted to understand if there was a connection between these people. If there was something that linked them together beyond the simple fact that they had all disappeared in the mountains. What I discovered was terrifying and eerie and completely unsettling. All of the bodies belonged to people who had been reported missing during specific weather events. All of the disappearances had occurred during unusual atmospheric conditions. High winds, fog so thick it was impossible to see, strange electrical phenomena. People had described seeing lights in the sky. People had reported hearing sounds that didn't match any known animal or natural phenomenon. And all of the missing people had something else in common. They had all expressed a compelling, almost irresistible urge to reach the highest peaks. They had all described a sensation of being called to the mountains. A compulsion that they couldn't explain or resist. They had all described dreams of climbing higher, reaching higher, ascending toward something that was waiting for them above the clouds. I found journals from several of the missing climbers. Entries that documented their growing obsession with reaching certain summits. Entries that described the feeling of being watched while climbing. Entries that mentioned hearing voices in the wind. Voices that seemed to be calling them upward. Calling them to climb higher than any person had climbed before, calling them toward something that existed in the highest reaches of the mountains. The final entries in these journals were always the same. The climbers would describe a moment of transcendence, a moment when they broke through the clouds and reached an altitude where the air was impossibly thin but somehow breathable. A moment when they saw something enormous and terrible and incomprehensibly ancient waiting for them at the summit. A moment when they understood that they had been climbing toward something that was neither human nor animal nor anything that belonged to our normal understanding of nature. And then the entries would stop. The climbers would disappear, and decades later, their frozen bodies would emerge from the glaciers as the ice melted and released its captives. I became terrified. I became convinced that something in the mountains was actively hunting. Something that was deliberately calling people to their deaths. Something that was using the glaciers as storage. A freezer for its trophies. A way to preserve its victims across decades. I tried to convince my employer that we should stop guiding teams to the glacier sites. I tried to tell them that something was wrong, that something dangerous was happening in the mountains. that we were putting people in danger by continuing these expeditions. They didn't believe me. They told me I was experiencing altitude sickness. They told me the accumulation of seeing so many dead bodies was affecting my mental health. They told me I should take some time off. They suggested I see a therapist, but I couldn't leave. I was compelled to continue. Every time I tried to book a flight away from the mountains, something would prevent me from going. My phone would malfunction. My car would break down. I would develop sudden, inexplicable illnesses that would resolve as soon as I accepted another guiding contract. It was like the mountains themselves didn't want me to leave. Like something in these peaks had decided that I should stay, that I should continue witnessing the ice giving up its dead, that I should continue documenting the emergence of these frozen bodies. And then, 3 weeks ago, something happened that confirmed all of my terrifying suspicions. I was leading a team to a glacier site when I heard it. A voice in the wind. A voice that was calling my name. The voice was hollow and distant and profoundly eerie. It was coming from inside the glacier itself. The voice was speaking in a language that I didn't understand, but I somehow comprehended its meaning. The voice was calling me to climb higher. The voice was telling me that I had been chosen. The voice was expressing a hunger for my presence at the summit of a specific peak. I tried to ignore the voice. I tried to focus on the task of guiding my team safely. But the compulsion was overwhelming. The urge to abandon my team and begin climbing toward the summit was nearly irresistible. It took everything in my power to maintain my professional composure and continue leading the group away from that particular glacier. That night, back at base camp, I examined my hands. And I realized something horrifying. My fingers were becoming discolored. They were developing that same dark, hardened appearance that I had seen on the preserved bodies emerging from the ice. My skin was starting to change. I was starting to become like them. I was starting to freeze. I packed my belongings and drove away from the mountains. I didn't tell my employer. I didn't notify search and rescue. I just left. I drove as far as I could get from the Rockies. I drove until I reached the plains and the flatlands where there were no mountains visible on the horizon. But even now, thousands of miles away from the peaks, I can hear the voice in the wind. I can hear it calling my name. I can feel the cold in my fingers spreading slowly through my body. I can feel myself being pulled back toward the mountains. I can feel the glaciers waiting for me. Most horrifying of all, I started to understand what is happening. I started to comprehend the true nature of what lives in those mountains. And I realized something that makes my blood run cold every time I think about it. The ice mummies, Aaron, separate from the thing that is calling from the peaks. They were not the result of something hunting the climbers. They were not victims of some external predator. The ice mummies are the thing that is calling from the mountains. They merged with the glacier. They become part of the ice itself. And the glacier is alive, conscious, aware, hungry for more people to climb to the summit so it can add them to its collection. So it can expand its network of frozen consciousness across the mountain range. Every person who answers the call and climbs to the summit becomes part of the glacier, becomes part of the ice, becomes part of the collective consciousness that exists in the frozen peaks. And as the glaciers melt and recede, those consciousnesses are being exposed. They re-emerging, they recalling to the living world. They trying to lure more climbers into their embrace. I feel myself getting colder every day. I can see my fingers becoming more discolored. I can feel the freezing process beginning. I know I don't have much time before my compulsion becomes too strong to resist. Before I find myself driving back toward the Rockies. Before I find myself climbing toward a summit that shouldn't exist. Before I find myself becoming part of the ice. The terrifying truth is that the ice mummies, Aaron, to the end of the process. They were just the beginning. They were the visible manifestation of something much larger and more sinister. The glaciers of the Rocky Mountains are a living organism. A thing that has learned to hunt. A thing that has learned to call. A thing that has been waiting in the frozen peaks for thousands of years, collecting victims, growing stronger, and now, as the ice melts and releases its secrets, beginning to reach out into the world. The chilling fact is that the glaciers are melting everywhere. Not just in the Rockies, glaciers are receding across the entire world. In the Alps, in the Himalayas, in glaciers throughout North America and Europe and Asia. All of them are exposing their ice mummies. All of them are revealing the frozen consciousnesses that have been trapped within them. And if my growing understanding of this horror is correct, then something is waking up. Something ancient and terrifying is beginning to emerge from the frozen places of the world. Something that has spent centuries and millennia developing its ability to lure and preserve and integrate human consciousness into itself. So here, this is my question for you, listener. If you knew that certain mountains or glaciers were actively hunting, that they were deliberately calling people to their deaths, would you believe the warning? Or would you dismiss it as the ravings of a disturbed mind? Right up until the moment when you felt the compulsion to climb higher, pulling at your consciousness with irresistible force. Write your answer in the comments. I need to know if anyone else understands the danger that is waiting in the frozen places. Story 3. Thing beneath the ice. I found the tooth marks on frozen human bone 3 miles from where any human should have been for the last 170 years. The Arctic does not forgive mistakes. It does not care about your research grant or your documentary crew or your dreams of discovering what really happened to the Franklin expedition. It just waits, patient and hungry, for you to make that one fatal error. I made mine when I decided to investigate the shadow I saw moving beneath the ice shelf near King William Island. My name is irrelevant now. What matters is that I was part of a research team studying the Franklin mystery, that horrifying chapter of exploration history that ended with 129 men vanishing into the frozen hell of the Canadian Arctic. They were searching for the Northwest Passage in 1845. They found something far worse. Everyone knows the basic story. 2 ships, the Erebus and Terror, trapped in ice. The crew's abandoning ship, bodies discovered years later by Inuit hunters who told disturbing tales of men gone mad, walking south toward nothing, dragging boats full of useless silver spoons and Christian prayer books. Tales of cannibalism. Tales of something darker that the historians prefer to blame on lead poisoning and scurvy. But the Inuit stories mentioned something else, something the academics dismiss as folklore. They spoke of a ship that should not exist, a vessel trapped in ice that appeared and disappeared, crewed by things that looked like men but were not. They spoke of sounds coming from beneath the frozen ocean, of shadows that moved independent of any light source, of a hunger that predated human understanding. I thought it was mythology. Beautiful, tragic mythology born from a culture trying to explain the inexplicable horror they had witnessed. Then I found the tooth marks. Then I saw what made them. We were camped on King William Island in late March, during that eerie twilight period where the sun barely rises and the world exists in perpetual dusk. Our team of 6 was documenting newly exposed artifacts revealed by melting permafrost. Climate change was unwrapping the Arctic's secrets, and we were racing to catalog them before they were lost forever. The temperature was negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that your breath freezes in your lungs, cold enough that exposed skin dies in minutes, cold enough that the world feels hostile to the very concept of life. We worked in shifts, documenting, photographing, carefully extracting items that had been frozen for nearly 2 centuries. On the 4th day, I found the bone. It was a human femur, gnawed and scored with marks that made my stomach turn. The bone had been cracked open, the marrow extracted. But the tooth marks were wrong. Too large, too deep. The spacing suggested something with a jaw that could not possibly belong to a starving human being. I photographed it, bagged it, said nothing to the others because I knew how insane it would sound. Lead poisoning makes men desperate. Starvation makes them animals, but it does not give them jaws that can splinter frozen bone like kindling. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my tent listening to the wind howl across the barren landscape, a sound like thousands of voices screaming in unison. The Arctic night is terrifying in its totality. The darkness is absolute, the cold is alive, and the silence between wind gusts feels like the earth is holding its breath. At 2 in the morning, I heard scraping sounds on the ice outside our camp. Rhythmic, purposeful, something being dragged. I told myself it was ice shifting, thermal contraction, any of a dozen rational explanations. But my body knew better. My heart was hammering. My mouth was dry. Every primitive instinct I possessed was screaming danger. I unzipped my tent and shone my flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through maybe 20 feet before being swallowed by the black. I saw nothing, but I felt watched. That horrible sensation of eyes on you from a direction you cannot identify. I retreated into my tent and did not sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, we found tracks. Not animal tracks, not human tracks, something in between. They circled our camp in a perfect spiral, coming closer with each rotation until they stopped just 5 feet from where I had been sleeping. Then they vanished, as if whatever made them had simply ceased to exist or had returned to somewhere we could not follow. Our team leader, a gruff Canadian archaeologist named Patterson, dismissed it as a polar bear. But his voice lacked conviction. His eyes kept darting to the ice, to the horizon, to anywhere but our faces. He knew something. We all felt it. The Arctic was wrong here. This place was wrong. That afternoon, I volunteered for a solo expedition to document a site 3 miles east where ground-penetrating radar had detected anomalies. I needed distance from the growing tension in camp. I needed to think. The tooth marks haunted me. The tracks haunted me. The feeling of being watched had not left me since I arrived on this godforsaken island. The trek was brutal. Wind chill pushed the temperature to -50. My goggles frosted over every few minutes. My fingers ached even inside thermal gloves. The landscape was alien, hostile, beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful. Just endless white broken by jagged pressure ridges where ice plates had collided and thrust upward like the spine of some buried leviathan. I reached the anomaly site and began scanning with the portable ground radar unit. The readings were bizarre. Something large was beneath the ice. Something metal. My heart rate spiked. Could it be one of the ships? The Terror had been found in 2016. The Erebus in 2014. But what if there was a third vessel? What if the Inuit stories were right? I marked the location and began carefully clearing snow from the surface ice. That is when I saw it. A shadow, moving beneath the ice. It was large, maybe 15 feet long, gliding smoothly about 6 feet below the surface. My rational mind said seal, whale, some Arctic marine life, but the shape was wrong. The movement was wrong. It moved like it was hunting. I stood frozen, watching this thing circle beneath me. Then it stopped, directly under my feet. I could see its outline clearly now through the ice. It was not a seal. It was not a whale. It had limbs. It had a shape that my brain refused to accept because it was almost human but fundamentally wrong in proportions and structure. Then it looked up at me. I saw its eyes through 6 feet of solid ice. They glowed with a pale light that had no natural source. They were intelligent, malevolent, ancient, and they recognized me not as a person but as prey. I ran. I do not remember making the decision. My body simply took over, some primordial part of my brain overriding everything else. I ran across that frozen wasteland with the ground radar unit banging against my hip, my lungs burning, my legs pumping, terror giving me strength I did not know I possessed. Behind me, I heard ice cracking, not the normal settling sounds. Purposeful cracking, something forcing its way upward, something that had been waiting beneath the frozen ocean for decades or centuries or longer, patient and hungry, fed occasionally by the unlucky or the foolish. I made it back to camp as the sun was setting, which in the Arctic twilight meant the world was sliding from gray into black. I was gasping, frost covering my face, my story spilling out in fragmented bursts. Patterson listened with an expression that was not surprise but confirmation. He knew. He had always known. He told us the truth then. Told us that the Franklin expedition had not just died from cold and starvation and lead poisoning. Told us that the Inuit stories were accurate. Told us that something had been trapped beneath the ice near King William Island long before Franklin arrived. Something that the crews of Erebus and Terror had accidentally released when their ships broke through unusual ice formations. The Inuit called them the Tuniat, the Ancient Ones, beings that existed before humans but could wear human shape like a coat. The last Franklin survivors had not died fleeing south. They had been hunted, consumed, and some had been transformed into something else, something that could not die, something that waited beneath the ice for the next ship, the next expedition, the next offering. Patterson said we were leaving immediately. We packed in controlled panic, everyone moving fast but trying not to show the fear that was choking us. But night was falling, and in the Arctic night, distances become meaningless. Directions become suggestions. The world becomes a maze where every path might lead you in circles. We were 2 miles from extraction point when the ice began to crack around us. Not beneath us, around us, deliberate fractures forming a circle that was slowly tightening. We ran for the center, the safest point, but safety was an illusion. The ice was not breaking. It was opening, and things were climbing out. They looked like men at first glance, dressed in tattered 19th century naval uniforms, faces frost-burned and hollow. But their movements were wrong, jerky, puppet-like, and their eyes had that same pale glow I had seen beneath the ice. They did not speak, did not make any sound. They just watched us with tilted heads and expressions of hunger that had been growing for 170 years. We scattered, survival instinct overriding group cohesion. I ran toward what I thought was south, toward the extraction point, but the Arctic plays tricks in darkness. I could hear screams behind me. Wet sounds, the crunch of something breaking that should not break. I did not look back. I could not look back. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed on ice that I prayed was solid. I lay there gasping, waiting to die, waiting for those things to find me. But they did not come. Hours passed. The screaming stopped. The wind returned to fill the silence. When dawn finally broke, I was alone. I activated my emergency beacon and waited. The rescue helicopter found me 12 hours later, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. I was the only survivor. The others were never found. No bodies, no equipment, nothing, just marks in the ice suggesting something had dragged them down through cracks that had sealed behind them. The official report blamed equipment failure and a freak ice breakup. They said the team had fallen through thin ice and drowned. They did not mention the tooth marks on the bone I had found. They did not mention Patterson, his confession. They did not mention the things that should not exist but do, waiting beneath the frozen ocean in places where human beings have no business going. I am writing this from a psychiatric facility in Ontario. They think I am traumatized. They think I imagined it. They are wrong, because every night at 2 a.m, I hear scraping sounds outside my window. I see shadows moving in patterns that defy light sources. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see those pale glowing eyes staring up at me through the ice, patient and hungry, waiting for the next time someone decides to disturb the frozen hell where the Franklin expedition discovered that some passages should never be explored. So tell me this, if you were offered a chance to explore the Arctic, to discover historical mysteries, to walk where doomed men walked before you, would you go? Or would you believe me when I say that some things are buried in ice for a reason? Write your answer in the comments, because I need to know if anyone else understands that the Franklin expedition did not just vanish. They were taken, and what took them is still down there, waiting beneath the ice, wearing the faces of dead men and dreaming of the warmth of human blood in that endless frozen darkness where nightmare and history become the same thing. Story 4. Highway of Tears. The hitchhiker appeared out of nowhere on Highway 16. Her thumb extended into the beam of my headlights. I should have kept driving. Everyone knows you do not stop on this stretch of road after dark. But something about her made me hit the brakes. Maybe it was the desperate look on her face. Maybe it was the fact that she was soaking wet despite the clear night. Or maybe, and this is what haunts me most, maybe she wanted me to stop. Highway 16 runs through British Columbia, connecting Prince George to Prince Rupert. 720 kilometers of desolate, terrifying wilderness. The locals call it the Highway of Tears. For over 5 decades, women and girls have vanished along this road. Indigenous women mostly, though not exclusively. Some bodies were found. Most were not. The official count stands at 18 confirmed victims. But everyone knows the real number is much higher. Some say 40, some say more than 70. I was driving the route for work, a long-haul delivery that took me through the heart of that cursed corridor. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone has. But stories are just stories until you find yourself alone on a dark highway, watching a young woman materialize from the shadows like something pulled from a nightmare. She could not have been more than 19. Long dark hair plastered to her face, eyes that reflected my headlights like an animal. She wore jeans and a thin jacket, completely inadequate for the cold northern night. I rolled down my window, already knowing I was making a mistake but unable to stop myself. She did not speak. She just stared at me with those unsettling eyes, then pointed down the highway. East, deeper into the wilderness, away from any town or gas station or place where human beings might offer safety. Every instinct screamed at me to drive away, but I found myself unlocking the passenger door instead. She climbed in, bringing with her the smell of pine trees and something else. Something rotten and earthy, like a grave left open too long. She did not acknowledge me, did not thank me, just sat there, dripping water onto my seat, staring straight ahead through the windshield. I tried to ask where she was going. The words died in my throat. The air in the cab had turned frigid, my breath coming out in clouds despite the heater running full blast. I started driving. What else could I do? The highway stretched ahead, empty and black, swallowed by forest on both sides. No other cars, no lights, just the endless white line and the oppressive darkness pressing in from all directions. My passenger remained motionless, her wet hair leaving streaks on the window when her head bobbed with the movement of the truck. That is when I noticed her hands. They were covered in dirt, dark soil packed under her fingernails and ground into the creases of her palms, like she had been digging or clawing, and her wrists bore marks, deep indentations that looked like restraints had cut into her skin. My horror grew with each detail I noticed. This was not right. Nothing about this situation was right. The radio crackled to life on its own, cycling through static-filled stations. Through the white noise, I caught fragments of voices. Women's voices, crying, pleading, calling out names in languages I did not understand. My passenger turned her head slowly toward me, and I saw that her eyes were completely black. No whites, no irises, just solid darkness that seemed to absorb the light from the dashboard. I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop in the middle of the highway. My heart hammered against my ribs as I turned to confront her, to demand answers, to understand what was happening. But she was gone. The passenger seat was empty except for a puddle of dirty water and a handful of soil. The door had never opened. She had simply vanished. I sat there, engine idling, hands shaking on the steering wheel. The forest around me felt alive, watchful, malevolent, and I realized with chilling certainty that I was not alone. Through my mirrors, I saw them. Dozens of figures standing along the roadside, barely visible in the darkness. Women and girls of all ages, their faces pale and gaunt, their clothes from different decades. Some wore modern jeans and hoodies. Others wore dresses from the 70s and 80s. All of them stood perfectly still, watching my truck with hollow, accusing eyes. They were the missing, the murdered, the forgotten victims of Highway 16, and they wanted me to see them, to acknowledge what had happened on this cursed stretch of road, to bear witness to their suffering. I pressed down on the accelerator, desperate to escape, but the figures kept pace with my truck, gliding through the trees alongside the highway. More appeared ahead, standing in the middle of the road, forcing me to swerve around them. Each time I passed one, I felt a blast of cold air and heard whispers. Names, dates, fragments of final moments, the terror these women had experienced before they died. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, transforming into an endless corridor of darkness and horror. I passed landmarks I had driven by an hour earlier. The same crooked mile marker, the same fallen tree by the shoulder. I was trapped in some kind of loop, condemned to drive this nightmare road for eternity. Then I saw the lights, red and blue, flashing in my rearview mirror, a police car, solid and real, pulling up behind me. I had never been so relieved to be stopped by law enforcement in my life. I pulled over, nearly sobbing with relief. The officer approached my window, flashlight in hand, his expression concerned. He asked if I was okay. I tried to explain what I had seen. The hitchhiker, the figures, the loop. But the words came out jumbled and incoherent. He asked if I had been drinking. I insisted I was sober, just terrified. He studied me for a long moment, then told me something that made my blood run cold. Every few months, someone reports the same experience on this stretch of highway. The hitchhiker who vanishes. The figures in the forest. The sense of being watched by the dead. He said the First Nations communities have known about it for generations. The land remembers the violence done here. The spirits of the murdered women will not rest. They reach out to travelers, trying to tell their stories, seeking justice that never came. He advised me to keep driving and not stop again until I reached Prince Rupert. He said the women mean no harm. They are just trying to be seen, to be remembered, but their presence is disturbing, unsettling, a constant reminder of the horror that has unfolded along this highway for decades. I drove straight through the night, my eyes locked on the road, refusing to look at the shadows moving between the trees. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the oppressive feeling lifted. The highway became just a highway again. But I knew what I had experienced was real. The spirits of the Highway of Tears had shown themselves to me, and I would carry that encounter for the rest of my life. The truly horrifying part is not the supernatural manifestations. It is the fact that this is still happening. Women are still going missing on Highway 16. Families are still grieving. Killers are still out there, prowling that isolated stretch of road, knowing that the vastness of the wilderness makes it easy to hide their crimes. The ghosts I saw were not just echoes of the past. They were warnings about the present. Since that night, I have researched the Highway of Tears extensively. I have read about the victims, learned their names, studied their faces. Teenage girls hitchhiking home from school, young mothers trying to reach the next town, grandmothers walking along the shoulder. Each one had a life, a family, dreams and fears and hopes. Each one was erased, their stories reduced to cold case files and memorial markers. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police have connected some of the murders. Cody Legibakov was convicted of killing 4 women. Bobby Jack Fowler was identified posthumously as responsible for 2 deaths. But most cases remain unsolved. The victims' families live with that terrible uncertainty, never knowing exactly what happened to their loved ones or who took them away. I do not drive Highway 16 anymore. I refuse the routes that would take me through that cursed landscape. Some of my coworkers mock me for it, call me superstitious or weak. Let them. They have not seen what I have seen. They have not felt the presence of all those lost souls, desperate to be heard, reaching out from beyond death to make sure no one forgets them. The hitchhiker visits me in my dreams sometimes. She stands at the foot of my bed, dripping water and dirt, her black eyes boring into mine. She does not speak. She does not need to. Her message is clear. Remember us. Tell our stories. Do not let the world forget what happened on the Highway of Tears. So I am telling you now, if you ever find yourself driving through northern British Columbia, if you ever take Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert, pay attention. Watch the tree line. Notice the memorials along the roadside. And if you see someone hitchhiking after dark, especially a young Indigenous woman, call the police. Do not stop. Do not pick her up. Because you cannot know if she is a living person in danger or a ghost trying to warn you about the evil that still haunts that highway. The land holds secrets, the forest keeps them, and the spirits of the murdered women walk eternal vigil, trying to protect others from suffering their fate. Their presence is eerie, chilling, deeply unsettling, but it comes from a place of pain and a desperate need for justice. The Highway of Tears is not just a location. It is a wound that refuses to heal, a scar on the landscape that bleeds suffering and loss. And until every killer is caught, until every family has answers, until society finally protects Indigenous women the way they deserve, the haunting will continue. So here's my question for you. If you encountered the spirits of the Highway of Tears, if you were given the chance to witness their suffering and hear their stories, would you have the courage to speak up? Would you share what you learned, demand justice, push for change? Or would you drive away and try to forget, letting the cycle of violence and silence continue? Write your answer in the comments. Because right now, tonight, those spirits are walking. And somewhere along that dark highway, another person might be in danger. The question is, will anyone listen in time? Story 5, Room 10. Have you ever heard a child laughing in a place where no children should be? Not the innocent sound of playground joy, but something else, something wrong, echoing through empty hallways in the middle of the night. I used to manage hotels, small, independent places mostly, the kind that survive on steady local business and the occasional road-weary traveler looking for something cheaper than the chain motels off the highway. I've dealt with every problem you can imagine. Burst pipes, drunk guests, bed bugs, break-ins. 15 years in the hospitality industry teaches you to handle anything with a smile and a solution. But nothing in my experience prepared me for the 3 months I spent at the Gladstone Hotel in Manitoba. Most Americans have never heard of Gladstone. It's a tiny town in central Manitoba. Population maybe 800. Sitting on the shores of Lake Gladstone about 2 hours northwest of Winnipeg. The kind of place that exists because it has to, serving the farmers and ranchers scattered across the surrounding prairie. One gas station, one grocery store, a handful of churches, and the Gladstone Hotel, a 3-story brick building that has been standing on Main Street since 1902. The hotel looks exactly like you'd expect for a structure that old. Victorian architecture, tall windows, ornate cornices weathered by over a century of brutal Canadian winters. It's beautiful in that faded, forgotten way that makes you think of ghost stories in old photographs. Which, as I learned, was entirely appropriate. I took the manager position in February. The previous manager had quit suddenly, no notice, just walked out one morning and never came back. The owner, an elderly man named Douglas who lived in Winnipeg, seemed desperate to fill the position. He offered me 20% more than I was making at my previous hotel and covered my relocation expenses. I should have asked more questions about why he was so eager. I should have wondered why a small-town hotel needed to pay premium wages to keep a manager. But I needed the money, and frankly, the idea of running a quiet little hotel in the middle of nowhere sounded perfect after years of dealing with urban chaos. The first 2 weeks were normal, pleasant, even. The hotel had 12 rooms across the second and third floors, plus a small restaurant and bar on the ground level that served as the town primary gathering spot. Most of our guests were salesmen passing through or workers doing contract jobs in the area. The staff consisted of 2 cleaning ladies, a cook, and a bartender who doubled as night clerk. Everyone was friendly, professional, and distinctly nervous about something they wouldn't discuss. I noticed the oddities slowly. Small things at first. Items in the storage room rearranged overnight. Cleaning supplies moved from where they'd been left. Doors that I locked standing open in the morning. The staff blamed it on each other or on me forgetting, but I knew better. I've managed hotels long enough to trust my routines. Then there was room 10. It sat at the end of the second-floor hallway, overlooking Main Street. A decent room, nicely furnished, with a brass bed frame and antique dresser that gave it more character than the other units. But it was never occupied. I checked the reservation system and found that room 10 hadn't been rented in over 4 years. When I asked Douglas about it, he got quiet on the phone, then told me in a tight voice that the room had maintenance issues and should remain vacant until further notice. I accepted that explanation for exactly 3 days, until I was doing rounds at midnight and heard the laughter. It was a child, this voice, high and clear, giggling with that unsettling quality that makes it sound both innocent and somehow aware of something adults can see. The sound was coming from the second floor. I climbed the stairs, my heart beating faster than it should, telling myself it was probably a guest, this kid who couldn't sleep, even though I knew we had no families checked in. The hallway was empty, dark except for the emergency lights casting everything in dim red. The laughter continued, moving, seeming to come from different directions as I walked. I followed it to the end of the hall, where it stopped abruptly outside room 10. The door was closed, locked, I confirmed, trying the handle. But inside, I could hear something. Movement, soft footsteps crossing the floor, the creak of bed springs, and then, so faint I almost missed it, a voice. Not a child this time, a woman, speaking words I couldn't quite make out, her tone urgent and afraid. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was empty, completely vacant. The bed was made perfectly, the surfaces dust-free. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. But the temperature inside was wrong. It had to be 15 degrees colder than the hallway, cold enough that my breath misted in the air. And underneath the smell of cleaning products and old wood, there was something else. Something organic and unpleasant, like meat left out too long. I backed out of the room and locked it again, my hands shaking. The logical part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Air conditioning malfunction, though the hotel used radiator heat and had no AC. Audio carrying through the ventilation system, though I heard the sounds move through the room itself. But the fear in my gut knew better. Something was wrong with room 10. Something that explained why it sat empty year after year. Why the previous manager had fled. Why Douglas would pay extra to keep someone desperate or foolish enough to stay. The next morning, I confronted the cleaning ladies. Asked them directly what was going on in room 10. They exchanged glances, and the older one, a woman named Margaret who worked at the hotel for 20 years, finally told me the truth. The room was haunted. Everyone in town knew it. The staff had experienced it firsthand, dozens of times over the years. Objects moving on their own, thrown across the room with violent force. Furniture rearranged overnight into disturbing patterns. The laughter of children echoing through empty spaces. And worst of all, the presence that guests reported feeling in that room. A malevolent awareness that watched them sleep and filled them with such overwhelming dread that they flee in the middle of the night, leaving their belongings behind. The poltergeist activity had started in the 70s, Margaret said, though some of the older residents claimed the hotel had always been strange. But it got worse after a family with 2 young children stayed in room 10 in 1978. Something happened that night, something the family never spoke about publicly, but the next morning they left town immediately. One of the children, a 6-year-old girl, had to be hospitalized for severe psychological trauma. She kept screaming about the woman in the walls who wanted to take her away. After that, the activity intensified. Room 10 became known across Manitoba as one of the most haunted locations in the province, drawing comparisons to famous American cases like the Sallie House in Kansas. Paranormal investigators had visited multiple times, documenting unexplained phenomena, recording EVPs of children, voices and women crying, capturing images of shadow figures. The hotel had embraced it for a while, advertising the haunting, charging premium rates for brave souls who wanted to spend a night in the room. But the experiences were too intense, too terrifying. Guests would leave traumatized, threatening lawsuits. Eventually, Douglas sealed the room, stopped renting it, and tried to pretend it didn't exist. I should have quit right then. Should have called Douglas, told him to find another manager, and driven back to the States where hotel problems were limited to the normal, rational, manageable kind. But I didn't. Maybe it was pride, or stubbornness, or some deep-seated need to prove that I could handle anything. Or maybe, and this thought still terrifies me, something in that room wanted me to stay. The encounters escalated quickly after that conversation, almost like acknowledging the haunting gave it permission to stop hiding. Guests on the second floor complained about footsteps running up and down the hallway at 3 a.m. The bartender found glasses arranged in a perfect circle on a table, all filled with water, despite the bar being locked and empty overnight. I started hearing the laughter regularly, sometimes during the day, coming from different parts of the hotel, always moving, always just out of sight. But it was the objects that frightened me most. Small things at first, items moving from one place to another. My keys disappearing from my office desk and reappearing in the freezer. Cleaning supplies stacked in impossible towers in the storage room. Then it got worse. Violent. I watched a coffee mug fly off the bar and smash against the wall with no one near it. A chair in the restaurant suddenly spun and toppled over while I was standing 10 feet away. A picture frame fell from the second floor hallway wall and crashed at my feet as I walked past, the glass shattering in a pattern that looked disturbingly deliberate. I started researching the hotel's history, digging through old newspaper archives and city records. What I found made everything worse. The building wasn't originally a hotel. It had been a boarding house in its early years, then a hospital during the flu pandemic of 1918. Over 60 people died in the building during that outbreak, including 7 children. The second floor had been the isolation ward, where the most severe cases were kept. Room 10 had been the morgue. The implications made my skin crawl. All those deaths, all that suffering, concentrated in one small building. No wonder something lingered. The more disturbing detail was what I found in a newspaper from 1923. A woman named Sarah Blackwood had murdered her 2 children in room 10, then taken her own life. The article described her as having suffered from severe melancholy and delusions. She told neighbors that voices in the walls were telling her to hurt the children, that something in the room wanted them. After reading that, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just ignore what was happening, couldn't keep running a hotel where guests and staff were being terrorized by something we couldn't see or control. I contacted a paranormal investigation team based out of Winnipeg, researchers who documented hauntings across Canada. They agreed to spend a weekend at the hotel, focusing on room 10. I'll never forget that investigation. The team arrived on Friday evening with cases full of equipment, EMF meters, digital recorders, thermal cameras, motion sensors. They were professional, experienced, approaching the case with scientific skepticism. That skepticism lasted about 2 hours. The activity started as soon as they entered room 10. Their equipment went haywire immediately, EMF readings spiking to impossible levels, thermometers recording temperature drops of 40 degrees in seconds. They captured dozens of EVPs, most of them children, as voices speaking in whispers. "Help us. Take us away." She won. "Let us leave." The thermal camera caught what looked like human shapes moving through the room, cold spots in the vague form of a woman and 2 smaller figures that might have been children. Then, just after midnight, everything changed. The playful, childlike phenomena stopped. Something else emerged, something older and angrier. The team, as lead investigator, a man who spent 20 years studying paranormal activity, went pale as his equipment began registering what he described as a massive concentration of negative energy. The temperature in the room plummeted. Ice formed on the windows from the inside, and everyone present felt it. An overwhelming presence of pure malevolence, a consciousness that radiated hatred and hunger. Objects began flying around the room, not drifting or sliding, but hurling with violent force. A lamp smashed into the wall. The mattress lifted off the bed frame and slammed down repeatedly. The dresser drawers flew open and their contents scattered across the floor. And through it all, a sound filled the room. A woman, this voice, screaming in rage. Words distorted and wrong, like multiple voices speaking at once. The team fled, grabbed their equipment and ran from the hotel, loading their van in panic silence and driving away without even saying goodbye. The lead investigator called me the next morning from Winnipeg. He told me in a shaking voice that room 10 was the most active and malevolent location he ever investigated. Whatever was there wasn't just residual energy or confused spirit. It was intelligent, powerful, and deeply hostile to the living. He strongly advised that the room be sealed permanently and blessed by every religious authority we could find. I finally called Douglas and told him I was done, explained everything that had happened, demanded he either deal with the haunting properly or find another manager. He listened in silence, then told me something I hadn't known. The hotel was for sale, had been for 3 years, but no one would buy it. Everyone who toured the property experienced something in room 10. Something so disturbing they walked away from what should have been a profitable investment. I quit that day, packed my things, drove back across the border, and tried to forget. But the Gladstone Hotel doesn't let you forget that easily. For months afterward, I to hear that laughter in my new apartment, usually at 3 in the morning, faint but unmistakable. I find my belongings moved, arranged in patterns I recognized from the hotel. And twice, I woke up to see a shadow standing at the foot of my bed, a woman, this shape, perfectly still, watching me sleep. The phenomena finally stopped about a year ago. I don't know why. Maybe distance finally broke whatever connection I deformed with that place. Or maybe whatever haunts room 10 found someone new to terrorize. I looked up the hotel recently, curious despite myself. It is still operating. Douglas hired another manager, though I noticed the turnover rate suggests they don't last long. Room 10 remains vacant, sealed off from guests, a permanent monument to whatever horror dwells within. And the reports continue, staff quitting suddenly, guests fleeing in the middle of the night, the laughter echoing through empty hallways, the malevolent presence that waits in that cold, dark room, patient and hungry and impossibly aware. So here is my question for you, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If you had the chance to spend one night in room 10, if someone offered you money or dared you to stay, would you do it? Would you risk facing whatever lurks in that room, knowing that everyone who has experienced it has come away traumatized? Or would you walk away, accepting that some places should remain empty, some doors should stay locked, and some mysteries are better left alone? Write your answer in the comments, because I need to know if I'm the only one who understands that some hauntings aren't just echoes of the past. They reliving things, conscious and cruel, waiting in the darkness for the next person foolish enough to ignore the warnings. Story 6. Kitsault, the town that time forgot. The town still has groceries in the refrigerators, and no one has lived here for 42 years. I am standing in a kitchen that time forgot, staring at food that should have rotted decades ago but somehow hasn't. The milk carton is from 1982. The bread is still on the counter. The light is still on in the refrigerator. Everything in Kitsault, British Columbia, is frozen in a single moment, and I'm starting to understand that I might not ever leave. My name is Thomas, and I need to tell you what happened to me in this terrifying and eerie ghost town before I forget. Before the darkness takes the memories like it takes everything else here. I am a freelance journalist, 38 years old, currently unemployed and desperately looking for a story that will make my career. I spent the last 3 years writing articles that nobody reads for websites that nobody visits. Articles about local politics, community events, the kind of content that puts people to sleep. I needed something different, something big, something that would make editors actually want to publish my work. That's how I found out about Kitsault. It's a real place. A municipality in northwestern British Columbia. In the middle of nowhere, surrounded by mountains and forest and absolute isolation. In the late 1970s, a mining company called Molycorp discovered molybdenum deposits in the area and decided to build a town to house their workers and their families. They invested enormous amounts of money into the project. They created a complete community from scratch. Modern homes, a shopping center, a recreation center, schools, restaurants, grocery stores, everything a person would need to live a normal life in the Canadian wilderness. By 1982, the town had a population of around 1,200 people. Children played in parks, families had barbecues, people had jobs and mortgages and normal lives. It was a real functioning community. Not a ghost town or an abandoned settlement. A place where people actually lived. And then, Overnight, everyone vanished. The molybdenum market crashed. Molycorp pulled out. The mine shut down. And within what felt like days, the entire population abandoned the town. Every single person just left. They left their houses. They left their belongings. They left their lives as if they were going to come back, but they never did. For decades, Kitsault sat completely empty, a time capsule from the early 1980s, preserved in perfect condition because nobody was there to disturb it. Until a few years ago, when a single caretaker moved in to maintain the town. A man named Al Mackey who decided to live alone in this terrifying and haunted place. When I first read about Kitsault online, I knew I had found my story. A perfectly preserved ghost town, an abandoned community, the mystery of why so many people just walked away from their lives. It was the kind of narrative that editors would actually want to publish. It was the kind of story that might get picked up by bigger publications and actually led somewhere. So I drove north, 14 hours from Vancouver, through increasingly remote terrain, until I reached the entrance to Kitsault. The road was overgrown but passable. The mountains loomed around me, dark and thick with forest. The isolation was profound. I could go hours without seeing another car, hours without seeing any sign of human civilization. When I finally reached the town, I understood why people would want to abandon it. The first thing you notice about Kitsault is the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of silence as an almost physical force. The streets are empty and eerie. The houses are dark. The shopping center stands unopened, its windows reflecting nothing but darkness. There is a recreation center with a swimming pool visible through the windows, and I could see the water inside, still and perfect and somehow more disturbing than anything else I saw that day. It's the feeling that gets to you, though. The creeping sensation that you are in a place where something profoundly wrong happened. Where an entire community of human beings simply ceased to exist in this location. You can walk past a house and know that a family lived there. That children played in the rooms. That people ate dinner at tables and slept in beds and lived their lives before they disappeared. And now it's all just empty. Just buildings containing nothing but dust and the memory of lives that no longer exist. I met Al Mackey at the entrance to the main settlement. He was in his 70s, weathered and quiet, with the look of someone who had spent a long time alone. Very long. Too long. He had agreed to let me stay for a few days and document the town. He was happy to have a visitor. Or at least that is what he told me. Looking back now, I'm not sure if he was happy or if he was trying to warn me. You picked a strange place to visit, Al said as I pulled my car up to his residence. I am interested in abandoned towns, I told him. I am working on an article. You want? Find anything here, Al said. Just empty houses and memories. But that was wrong. I would find plenty. I would find more than I wanted to find. Al gave me a tour of the town. He walked me through the shopping center, which was fully stocked. There were products on the shelves from the early 1980s. Boxes of cereal, bottles of ketchup, toys and magazines and all the things that people used to buy before they suddenly decided to abandon their town. The cash register was still there, frozen in time. A bell on the counter ready to be rung by shoppers who never came. He took me to the recreation center. The swimming pool was there, full of water that looked clear and clean but also wrong. Like it had been chemically treated to stay preserved. Like it was waiting for children who would never come to splash in it. The sauna was still functional. The equipment in the gym was all in perfect condition. It was like a snapshot of a place where people stopped mid-activity and just left. He showed me residential neighborhoods where the houses still had furniture visible through the windows. Beds with sheets on them, televisions in living rooms, kitchen tables set as if the family was about to come home for dinner. All frozen, all waiting, all terrifying and eerie and deeply disturbing to witness. By evening, I was thoroughly unsettled. The creepy atmosphere of the town had started to get into my head. I could understand why Al lived here. The complete isolation and the frozen-in-time quality of everything created this strange psychological space where you felt like you were living in two time periods simultaneously. You could almost feel the presence of all those people who had lived here before they vanished. That first night, Al made me dinner in his house. He had electricity and running water because he had maintained the infrastructure. Everything still worked. The stove, the refrigerator, the lights, everything. It was like living in a functional ghost town. Like having access to the basic needs of human life in a place that had been abandoned by actual humans. During dinner, I asked him why he stayed here. Why he had chosen to live alone in this frightening and disturbing place. Al was quiet for a long time. He looked out the window at the dark streets of Kitsault, and his face had this expression on it that I can only describe as haunted. Like he was seeing something in those empty streets that I couldn't see. Something from the past, or something from somewhere else. I like the quiet, he finally said, and I like knowing what happened here. What did happen here? I asked. Why did people leave? The mine closed, Al said. The economy shifted. There was no reason to stay anymore. But his answer didn't match his face. His face said something different. His face said that there was more to the story than a simple economic collapse. His face said that Kitsault held secrets that weren't to be told. After dinner, I went to bed in the guest room of Al's house. I tried to sleep, but the silence of the town kept me awake. It was such a profound silence, such an absolute absence of sound, that it actually became a sound in itself. The silence had a presence. The darkness had weight. I lay there for hours, listening to the nothing, feeling the weight of all those abandoned lives pressing down on me. Around 2 a.m, I heard something. It was a sound coming from outside, from somewhere in the darkness of the town. It sounded like music, distant music, like a radio playing from far away. I got out of bed and walked to the window, and I could see something that made my blood go cold. There was a light on in one of the houses across the street. A soft glow in a window that had been dark and empty when Al had shown me around the town during the day. I went back to bed and tried to convince myself that I had imagined it. That the isolation and the eerie atmosphere of the place was starting to affect my mind. That the darkness and the silence were creating hallucinations. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined anything. I had seen that light, and it wasn't there by accident. The next morning, I asked Al about the house with the light. Which house? He asked. He was making coffee, his movements slow and deliberate. I described the location, the house across from his place, the window that had glowed in the night. Al was quiet. He poured coffee into a cup very carefully, and his hands were shaking slightly. I could see it now, this terrifying tremor that suggested something was deeply wrong with him. Something that living alone in this ghost town had done to him. That house has been empty for 42 years, Al finally said. I saw a light, I told him. You were tired, Al said. The mind plays tricks in Kitsault. It's the silence. It gets into your head. It makes you see things that aren't there. But I knew what I had seen. And I knew that Al knew what I had seen. And I knew that Al was lying to me about what Kitsault really was. That day, I decided to explore on my own. I told Al I was going to walk around the town and take photographs. He didn't try to stop me, but he did give me a warning. He told me not to go into the houses. He told me not to open any doors. He told me that it wasn't safe to disturb things in Kitsault. I didn't. Did you listen? I spent the day walking through the neighborhoods, photographing the empty houses, trying to document this strange and terrifying place. But as I walked, I started to notice something that Al hadn't mentioned. Something that made the entire experience even more horrifying. Many of the houses had been locked from the outside. The doors had chains on them. The windows had boards covering them. Someone had deliberately sealed these houses. Someone had gone through the town and systematically locked people in, or locked something in, or prevented access to something. I found one house that wasn't fully boarded up. A family home with a front door that was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and went inside, ignoring Al's warning about not entering the houses. And what I found inside made me understand that I needed to leave Kitsault immediately. The house was frozen in time, but not in the way I had expected. There were signs of a struggle. Furniture overturned, objects scattered, and on the walls, written in what looked like blood, were words. Desperate, terrifying words, messages from people who had been inside that house when something catastrophic happened. Help us. It won. Let us leave. The darkness is spreading. We can to get out. And then, most disturbing of all, it is in the town. It is in all of us. I photographed everything, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the camera steady. And then I heard it, that same music from the night before, coming from upstairs, soft and eerie and deeply, profoundly unsettling. I ran out of that house. I ran through the streets of Kitsault back toward Al's residence. And as I ran, I saw more lights coming on in the supposedly empty houses. I saw shadows moving behind the boarded windows. I saw the town coming alive in a way that it shouldn't to be alive. Like something was awakening, like something had been sleeping in these empty buildings, and my presence, my disturbance of this place, had caused it to stir. When I got back to Al's house, I told him what I had found. I showed him the photographs of the words written on the walls. I told him that I was leaving, that I was getting in my car and driving away from Kitsault and never coming back. Al's face went very pale. He looked at the photographs for a long time, and then he looked at me, and I saw in his eyes something that was profoundly, deeply wrong. He looked terrified, but not of me, terrified of something else, terrified of what I had done by entering that house. You disturbed it, Al said quietly. The town doesn't like to be disturbed. What are you talking about? I asked. What is in this town? The people never left, Al said. They were still here. In the buildings, in the streets, in the silence. Something happened here when the mine closed. Something happened in 1982 that we don't. Do you understand? The people decided to leave, but they couldn't. The town wouldn't let them. So they stayed, and over time, they merged with the town itself. They became part of Kitsault. And now Kitsault is alive. It is conscious. It is waiting. Waiting for what? I demanded. For people like you, Al said. For people who come looking for answers. For people who disturb the silence and wake things up. I grabbed my car keys and ran for my vehicle. Behind me, I could hear Al saying something, but I didn't stop to listen. I just drove. I drove as fast as I could out of Kitsault, down the overgrown road, through the dark forest, away from that terrifying and haunted place. But here is the nightmare part. Here is where everything becomes completely unsettling. When I checked my watch, I realized something was wrong. I had been in Kitsault for only 12 hours. I had arrived in the evening, had dinner with Al, slept through the night, explored the town during the day, and now I was leaving in late afternoon. 12 hours total, but my watch showed that 3 days had passed. When I got back to civilization and checked with the authorities, they confirmed something that made my blood turn to ice. I had been missing for 3 months. Not 3 days, 3 months. My car had been reported abandoned at the entrance to Kitsault 2.5 months ago. Search and rescue teams had found my car but couldn't find me. I had been presumed dead, but I had only been in Kitsault for 12 hours. Since then, they tried to document what happened to me, to explain the missing time, to make sense of what Kitsault actually is. The authorities have suggested that I experienced some kind of psychological break. That I had been in the town for 3 months, and my mind had compressed the memory into what felt like 12 hours. That what I'm experiencing is a form of trauma-induced false memory. But they haven't explained the photographs. I still have the pictures I took inside that house. I have the images of those words written on the walls. I have the proof that something was very wrong in Kitsault. And I have this growing, terrifying certainty that time doesn't work the same way in that place. That the town itself is a kind of trap. That it exists in a different temporal space than the rest of the world. And the longer you stay, the more time slips away from you. I received a letter last week from Al Mackey. It was postmarked from Kitsault. He wrote, "Come back. The town misses you. The town wants to keep you. You belong here now. You, part of Kitsault. Your body may have left, but something of you stayed behind. We can feel it, and when you come back, I'll remember that you always lived here. That they've been here since the beginning. That you will be here when the town finally opens up and swallows the rest of the world. I haven't gone back. I've tried to continue my normal life, but I can feel it. I can feel Kitsault pulling at me. I can feel the town, its presence in my mind. Sometimes I hear that eerie music from the night I stayed there. Sometimes I see shadows in my peripheral vision that look like people from the 1980s. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I ever actually left at all. I wonder if I am still there, in that frozen moment of time, and everything I am experiencing now is just my mind, this way of coping with what Kitsault really is. The town is still there. It is still maintained by someone, or something, pretending to be Al Mackey. It is still preserved in its perfect, terrifying state, and it is still waiting for the next person to arrive, looking for a story, looking for truth, looking for answers to the mystery of what happened to 1,200 people in 1982. They were all still there, in the houses, in the silence, in the darkness, and they hungry for company. They hungry for people to join them. They hungry for anyone who disturbs that eerie town and brings it back to horrifying, dangerous life. So here, it's my question for you, listener. If you knew for certain that a place like Kitsault existed, a location where time moves differently and people disappear into something impossible, would you be brave enough to visit it? Or would you be smart enough to stay away? Write your answer in the comments. I want to know. Story 7. Phantom Plane, a Newfoundland ghost. I watched a dead man fly his biplane directly into the cliffs, and nobody believes me. I am standing here in Newfoundland, in a small outport village called Blaketown, and I need to tell you what I saw during that terrifying storm 3 weeks ago before I lose my mind completely. My name is Robert, and I am a retired meteorologist who moved to this remote part of Canada hoping to find peace and quiet in my final years. Instead, I found something eerie and profoundly disturbing that has completely shattered my understanding of what is possible in our world. The evening started normally. I was sitting on the porch of my rental house, looking out at the Atlantic Ocean, watching the clouds gather on the horizon. I have spent my entire career studying weather patterns, reading the sky, understanding the physics of atmospheric conditions. I know storms. I understand them intimately, and I could see that something unusual was developing that night. The clouds were moving in patterns that didn't match normal meteorological models. The pressure was dropping in ways that seemed almost deliberately chaotic. The wind was shifting directions in unpredictable sequences. It was around 8 o'clock when the storm hit. Not gradually, the way normal storms arrive, but suddenly, violently, like someone had flipped a switch and unleashed absolute chaos on the landscape. Rain began falling in sheets so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The wind was howling with an intensity that actually sounded almost like a scream. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see frost forming on the window panes. I decided to go inside. I knew the storm was dangerous, and I wasn't interested in getting struck by lightning or injured by flying debris. I closed the door and windows, made myself tea, and settled into my house to wait out the worst of it. That's when I heard the sound. It was the engine of an airplane. An old airplane. I could tell from the distinctive pitch of the engine. That particular sound, that specific mechanical rhythm, I had only heard on recordings or in documentaries about the early 20th century. It was the sound of a rotary engine, the kind used in World War I aircraft. The sound was terrifying and eerie and completely out of place during a storm in Newfoundland. I went to the window and looked out through the rain, and that is when I saw it. A biplane, a genuine World War I era biplane, struggling to stay aloft in the violent storm, fighting the wind, losing altitude rapidly. The aircraft was moving from north to south, directly toward the cliffs that formed the dramatic rocky coastline near Blaketown. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside into the horrifying weather. My raincoat was immediately soaked through. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked me down. But I kept moving. I needed to see what was happening. I needed to understand what I was witnessing. The biplane was descending, spiraling down toward those terrible, jagged rocks. I could see the outline of the aircraft against the lightning flashes that were illuminating the stormy sky. The plane was damaged. One wing appeared to be partially torn away. Smoke was pouring from the engine. This was not a functioning aircraft. This was a machine in its death throes. And then it hit the cliff face. The impact was catastrophic. The biplane struck the rocky coastline with tremendous force, and the entire aircraft seemed to disintegrate on contact. Pieces of the plane scattered across the rocks. Fire erupted from the wreckage. The nightmare sight was burned into my vision with the brightness of the explosion combined with the lightning. I stood there, frozen, watching the flaming wreckage fall down the cliff face and disappear into the darkness below. I was witnessing a disaster, a tragedy. I was watching a man die. I ran back inside the house and called the authorities. I reported the crash. I gave them coordinates. I told them exactly what I had seen. The woman on the phone took down my information, and I could hear the skepticism in her voice even through the phone line. She told me that search and rescue teams would investigate in the morning when conditions permitted. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with the lights on, staring at the wall, replaying the image of the crashing biplane in my mind over and over again. The terrifying sight, the sound of the impact, the fire erupting from the wreckage. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was clear and cold and beautiful in that austere way that Newfoundland coast can be. I walked down to the cliff face where I had seen the plane crash. I wanted to look down into the rocks below. I wanted to see the wreckage. I wanted confirmation that what I had seen was real. There was nothing. No wreckage. No debris. No burned pieces of aircraft. No evidence that anything had crashed into those cliffs. The rocks were clean. The water below was empty. There was no sign whatsoever that a biplane had impacted this location the night before. I contacted search and rescue. They told me that they had searched the area extensively. They had found no aircraft, no wreckage, no bodies. They suggested that perhaps I had misidentified what I was seeing. Perhaps I had seen lightning. Perhaps my mind had interpreted natural phenomena as something more sinister. Perhaps I had experienced some kind of weather-related hallucination. But I knew what I had seen. I am a scientist. I understand the difference between objective reality and subjective perception. I know the difference between natural phenomena and mechanical objects. I had witnessed an aircraft crash. I was certain of it. I started asking questions around the small village. I spoke to the local fishermen. I talked to people at the grocery store. I asked if anyone else had seen anything unusual during the storm. That is when things started becoming genuinely creepy. An elderly woman named Mrs. Bridget Murphy told me that she had seen the same thing. A biplane crashing into the cliffs. She said she had reported it to the authorities years ago, and they had found no wreckage. She said that the authorities had suggested she was experiencing stress-induced hallucinations related to the death of her husband. A fisherman named Jack told me that his grandfather had seen the exact same event in the 1920s. A biplane crashing into the cliffs during a terrible storm. No wreckage, no explanation. The terrifying reality started becoming clear. The crash that I had witnessed was not a unique event. It was a repeating occurrence, a recurring phenomenon, a ghostly echo that manifested during specific storms and specific conditions. I did research. I spent hours at the library in the nearest town, searching through old newspapers and historical records. And I found it. Documentation of the phantom plane of Passchendaele. During the Battle of Passchendaele in the autumn of 1917, a Royal Flying Corps biplane piloted by a Canadian pilot named Major James Whitmore was shot down over Belgium. The official records listed him as killed in action, but that is when things became unsettling and eerie. Months later, in November of 1917, residents of Newfoundland reported seeing a biplane crash into the cliffs near Blaketown during a severe Atlantic storm. Multiple witnesses testified that they saw a World War I-era aircraft struggling through the violent weather before impacting the rocky coastline. Search efforts found no wreckage, no bodies, no evidence that any crash had occurred. The sightings continued. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, residents reported seeing the same phantom plane crashing during storms. Always during bad weather. Always impacting the same section of cliff. Always disappearing without a trace. Some people theorized that it was the spirit of Major James Whitmore. They believed that his consciousness had become somehow attached to the location of his death in Belgium, but was manifesting in his home region of Newfoundland. They believed he was reliving his final moments over and over, trapped in an eternal cycle of death and destruction. Others believed it was something different. They believed it was a temporal echo, a tear in the fabric of space and time that allowed events from the past to bleed through into the present. They believed that during certain atmospheric conditions, the crash at Passchendaele was literally reaching across the Atlantic Ocean and manifesting itself in Newfoundland. The official explanation was mass hysteria combined with weather-related misidentification. Authorities dismissed all the reports as products of overwrought imaginations and atmospheric illusions. But I knew better. I had seen it. I had witnessed the impossible. I had observed an aircraft that shouldn't to exist manifesting in real time, performing an action that had occurred decades in the past, and then vanishing completely. I became obsessed with understanding what I had seen. I began studying meteorological patterns. I started researching the specific conditions that seemed to precede the phantom plane disappearance. I interviewed other residents of Blaketown. I gathered testimonies. I collected data. And I discovered something horrifying. The phantom plane wasn't appearing randomly. It was appearing with increasing frequency. In the past 50 years, there had been approximately 7 documented sightings. In the past 10 years, there had been 9. In the past year, there had been 5. The appearances were accelerating, and most disturbing of all, each appearance seemed to last longer. The plane seemed more solid, more real, more present in our actual reality rather than existing as some kind of ethereal ghost. I began theorizing that the barrier between past and present was weakening. That somehow, the specific atmospheric and temporal conditions that existed during World War I were becoming increasingly aligned with the conditions that manifested over Newfoundland. That the crash of Major Whitmore's biplane was somehow becoming less of a historical event and more of an active, ongoing phenomenon. And then I received a letter. It was addressed to me at my rental house, but it had no return address. The envelope was old and yellowed, as if it had been waiting for decades to reach me. Inside was a letter written on paper that felt fragile and ancient. The letter was written by Major James Whitmore. It was written in 1917 from his base in Belgium. The handwriting was shaky and desperate. The words were a confession and a warning. Major Whitmore wrote that he had begun experiencing something profoundly unsettling during the Battle of Passchendaele. He wrote that he could sense a connection to the future. He could feel moments from his own death reaching backward through time. He could perceive the crash of his biplane manifesting across the Atlantic Ocean in his home country. He wrote that something was wrong with reality itself, that the war was creating a wound in the fabric of space-time, that the death and destruction and horror of Passchendaele was so intense, so profoundly traumatic, that it was literally tearing holes in existence. Most disturbing of all, Major Whitmore wrote that he believed the worst was yet to come. He wrote that the connection would grow stronger, that eventually the past wouldn't just be bleeding through into the present. He wrote that eventually something from the present would reach back into the past and change it. He wrote that eventually the entire cycle of causality would reverse and time itself would begin flowing backward. He wrote, "I can feel it coming. The moment when everything stops moving forward and starts moving back. The moment when all of history collapses into a single point. I think that moment is approaching. I think that when it arrives, everything will return to the trenches. Everything will become Passchendaele. All of existence will be consumed by the horror of that battle." I don't. Do you know why Major Whitmore? This letter reached me. I don't. Do you know how he could have possibly predicted my arrival in Newfoundland nearly a century after his death? But I am certain that the letter is real. I am certain that it is an authentic communication from a man trapped in temporal limbo. Since receiving the letter, the sightings have continued. Every storm now brings the phantom plane. Every weather disturbance creates the conditions for Major Whitmore to crash into the cliffs again. And each time, the plane seems more real. Each time, I can see more detail. The pilot, the damage to the aircraft, the expression on the face of the man who is dying over and over again. Last week, something new happened. During the most recent appearance, I watched the biplane crash into the cliffs. But this time, something was different. The plane didn't disappear. The wreckage remained visible for several minutes before gradually fading away. And in those minutes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I saw other wreckage, not from the biplane, but from other aircraft. From helicopters, from jets, from aircraft that haven't even been invented yet. I saw vehicles and machines from the future manifesting alongside the past. I saw the past and the future colliding and blending together. And I realized what Major Whitmore had been warning about. The barrier between time periods isn't just weakening. It is collapsing. The wound that was created at Passchendaele is growing. The horror of that battle is reaching both backward and forward, pulling all moments in time toward that single traumatic event. I believe that we are approaching a terrible culmination. I believe that very soon, the temporal collapse that Major Whitmore predicted will occur. I believe that all of history will converge on the moment of his death. I believe that Newfoundland will become a focal point for this catastrophic event. Most terrifying of all, I believe that I was meant to be here. I believe that my presence in this location at this specific time is not coincidental. I believe that I have somehow been drawn here to witness the final stages of reality. This unraveling. The phantom plane will appear again during the next storm. I know this with absolute certainty. And when it does, something will be different. Something will have changed in the nature of the manifestation. And I suspect that this time, the barrier between past and present will shatter completely. I don't know what will happen when that occurs. But based on Major Whitmore's letter, I know that it will be terrible and apocalyptic and impossible to survive. So here is my question for you, listener. If you knew that a specific location was becoming a focal point for temporal collapse, a place where past and future were about to converge in a catastrophic way, would you flee that place as far and as fast as possible? Or would you stay to witness what happens, even knowing that witnessing it might destroy you? Write your answer in the comments. I need to know if anyone else out there understands why I cannot bring myself to leave Newfoundland. Story 8. Footprints that stopped. The footprints ended in the middle of nowhere. Not at a cliff edge. Not at a river. Not at any place where a person might logically disappear. They just stopped, mid-stride, as if Warren Coven had been plucked from the earth by invisible hands. I stood there in the snow, staring at that final impression of his boot, and felt something cold crawl down my spine that had nothing to do with the Nova Scotia winter. I am a private investigator specializing in missing persons cases. 23 years of tracking down runaways, deadbeat parents, people who wanted to vanish. I have seen it all, or I thought I had, but the Warren Coven case, that was different. That was terrifying in a way that defies rational explanation. And what I discovered in those woods, what I experienced during my investigation, it changed something fundamental in how I see the world. Warren was a 47-year-old writer who had moved to a remote cabin in the Nova Scotia wilderness to work on his novel. Classic setup. Guy wants isolation, peace, and quiet. No distractions. His family said he was eccentric but harmless. A little paranoid maybe, always talking about government surveillance and corporate conspiracies, but creative types tend toward the dramatic. Nothing suggested he was in danger or planning to disappear. His sister called me when he missed their weekly check-in. 2 weeks of silence. No emails. No phone calls. Warren was religious about those Sunday calls. She insisted. Something was wrong. She gave me directions to his cabin, warned me the road was rough and the location remote, then begged me to find her brother. The fear in her voice was real, deep, the kind of fear that comes from knowing, somehow, that something horrible has happened. The drive took 5 hours from Halifax, the last 2 on increasingly primitive roads that eventually gave way to a snow-covered trail barely wide enough for my truck. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, a small structure that looked hand-built, with smoke rising from the chimney. Smoke, that detail registered immediately as wrong. If Warren had been gone for 2 weeks, why was there smoke? I approached cautiously, that professional paranoia kicking in. The door was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was warm, almost hot. The wood stove burned steadily, recently stoked. A half-empty coffee mug sat on the kitchen table, still warm to the touch. His laptop was open, displaying the last paragraph he had written. His coat hung on a hook by the door. His boots were gone, but everything else suggested he had just stepped outside for a moment and would return any second. But he had not returned. Not in 2 weeks. And somehow, that fire kept burning. I checked every inch of the cabin. Food in the cupboards, clothes in the drawers, toiletries in the bathroom. Nothing packed, nothing missing except Warren himself and the boots he apparently wore when he left. On his desk, I found his journal. The last entry was dated the day before his sister expected his call. The words made my skin crawl. He wrote about hearing footsteps outside the cabin at night. Heavy footsteps that circled the building, stopping at each window as if something was looking inside. He described a smell that accompanied the sounds, like wet earth and decay. He mentioned seeing movement in the trees, shapes that were almost human but not quite right in their proportions. The writing became increasingly frantic over the final entries. He was convinced something was watching him, stalking him, waiting for the right moment. The last line read, "It called my name tonight," in a voice that sounded like my father. But my father is dead. I stepped back outside, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The sun was already dropping toward the horizon, painting the snow orange and red. I needed to search the perimeter before dark. That is when I found the footprints. A single set of tracks. Warren, his size, leading from the back door directly into the forest. They were fresh despite the 2-week timeline, as if the snow had preserved them perfectly, or as if they were much newer than they should have been. I followed the tracks. They moved in a straight line, unwavering, through dense underbrush that should have forced any rational person to deviate or turn back. But Warren had pushed forward, breaking through brambles, stepping over fallen logs, maintaining that eerie direct path. The footprints were deep, pressed hard into the snow as if he was running or being pulled. No hesitation, no indication he had looked back or tried to return. The forest grew darker the farther I went. The trees seemed to close in, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the failing light. I kept my flashlight trained on the tracks, following them deeper and deeper into the woods. My GPS showed I was moving northeast, away from any roads or trails, away from anything resembling civilization. Then the tracks just stopped. One moment I was following a clear trail. The next I was staring at a final footprint with nothing beyond it. I circled the area, searching for any continuation. Maybe he had jumped. Maybe he had been picked up by a vehicle, though how a vehicle could reach this location was beyond me. But there was nothing, just that one last print, frozen in time, and virgin snow stretching ahead in every direction. I knelt beside the final footprint, examining it closely. The impression was deep, deeper than the others, as if Warren had put all his weight on that one foot, or as if something had pushed down on him from above. The snow around the print was disturbed, not smooth. Patterns swirled in the white surface, almost like wings had brushed against it. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, wet earth and decay. The same smell Warren had described in his journal. The temperature dropped suddenly. Dramatically. My breath went from visible clouds to instant frost. The light from my flashlight seemed to dim, as if something was absorbing the illumination. And I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the trees behind me. Circling. Getting closer. I spun around, sweeping my flashlight through the darkening forest. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and the growing darkness. But the footsteps continued. I could hear them clearly now, crunching through the snow, moving with purpose. And then I heard my name, spoken in a voice I recognized. My father. His voice. My father, who had been dead for 8 years. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I am trained for dangerous situations. I pulled my weapon, a 9mm I carry for protection in the field. The footsteps stopped. The forest went completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing, just oppressive, terrifying silence that pressed against my ears. Then I saw it, a shape between the trees. Tall, too tall. Its proportions were wrong, elongated, as if something had taken a human form and stretched it vertically. It stood perfectly still, barely visible in the dying light, watching me. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, and I understood, with chilling certainty, that this was what had taken Warren. This was what had called to him in his father's voice, led him into the woods, and pulled him from existence. I did not wait to see what it would do next. I ran, abandoning all professional composure. I crashed back through the forest, following my own tracks, desperate to reach the cabin, the truck, anywhere with walls and doors and the illusion of safety. The footsteps followed, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there, always pursuing. I burst from the tree line and sprinted to the cabin. Inside, I slammed the door and locked it. The windows showed only darkness now. Full night had fallen while I was in the woods. I grabbed Warren's journal, his laptop, anything that might provide evidence or explanation. The fire in the stove had gone out. The cabin was freezing, and outside, I could hear it, circling, stopping at each window, just like Warren had described. It stayed there all night. I sat against the far wall, weapon drawn, flashlight dying, listening to those footsteps pace around the cabin. Occasionally something would scratch at the walls. Occasionally I would hear my name called in that terrible familiar voice. But it did not try to enter. It just waited, watching, patient. Dawn came as the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The moment sunlight touched the cabin windows, the presence vanished. The footsteps stopped, the oppressive feeling lifted. I gathered my evidence and ran to my truck. I did not look back. I did not investigate further. I just drove until I reached civilization, my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind replaying those impossible footprints ending in nothing. I filed my report, delivered Warren his belongings to his family. But I could not tell them the truth. How could I explain what I had experienced? How could I make anyone believe that something in those woods was taking people, calling to them in the voices of their dead, leading them to a point where they simply ceased to exist? The official investigation concluded Warren had suffered a mental breakdown and wandered off to die in the wilderness. His body was never found. The case was closed. But I know the truth. Warren did not die. He was taken, pulled from reality by something that exists in those deep woods, something that watches and waits and calls to the lonely and isolated. I have researched similar cases since then. Disappearances in remote areas where the footprints just stop. People vanishing from locked cabins with no sign of forced entry. Always in wilderness. Always in places where humans rarely go. The pattern is there if you know how to look. And it is terrifying, because it suggests this is not an isolated phenomenon. It suggests there are places in the world where the rules break down, where things exist that should not, where people can simply cease to be. I returned to that location once more, months later, in broad daylight with a full team. The cabin was gone, not burned, not collapsed, just gone, as if it had never existed. The clearing was empty forest, trees growing in spaces where walls had stood. No foundation, no evidence anything had ever been built there. My GPS insisted we were in the correct location, but reality had rearranged itself. Warren Coven is still missing. His case remains unsolved, and somewhere in the Nova Scotia wilderness, those footprints are still there, ending in nothing, waiting for someone else to follow them, waiting for the next person to hear their name called in a voice they recognize. waiting to pull another soul from the world and leave nothing behind but questions and terror. So here's my question for you. If you were alone in a remote cabin and heard footsteps circling outside at night, if you heard your name called in the voice of someone you loved who had died, would you stay inside and resist? Or would you open that door and follow that voice into the darkness, trusting that it truly was who it claimed to be? Write your answer in the comments, because somewhere out there, in forests and mountains and places where humans rarely venture, something is waiting. Something that knows exactly how to make you come to it. And once you take that first step, once you follow those footprints into the trees, there is no coming back. Story 9. Ghost Bride, a Banff Springs nightmare. I saw her dancing alone at 3 in the morning, and I knew immediately that I was going to die in this hotel. That's the moment everything changed. It's the second when my comfortable, normal life ended, and I stepped into something terrifying and eerie that I still don't to fully understand. My name is Sarah, and what I am about to tell you is absolutely true. Every word of it actually happened to me, and I need you to hear it. I need someone to know what really goes on inside the Banff Springs Hotel when the sun goes down and the guests finally go to sleep. Let me back up. 3 weeks ago, I was just a normal woman living a normal life. I work in marketing in Calgary. Divorced. No kids. Spending my weekends hiking in the Canadian Rockies or binge watching true crime documentaries. I am not someone who believes in ghosts. I'm not someone who gets spooked easily. I am logical, practical, grounded in reality. Or at least I was before I took that job. The Banff Springs Hotel is one of the most beautiful and famous hotels in Canada. If you've ever seen pictures of the Canadian Rockies, you've probably seen this place. It's massive, like a castle dropped into the mountains. Stone and turrets and this incredible architecture that looks like it belongs in Europe, not in Alberta. The hotel sits right in the heart of Banff National Park, surrounded by stunning peaks and pristine forest. It's the kind of place people dream about visiting, the kind of place that costs thousands of dollars a night. I got hired as a special events coordinator. The hotel was hosting a series of high-end conferences and galas throughout the fall and winter, and they needed someone to manage logistics, coordinate with vendors, handle the scheduling. Good money, flexible hours. The main catch was that I had to live on site for 3 months. They provided a small staff apartment in one of the hotel's wings. Free food, free lodging, and a salary that made my eye twitch when I saw the number. I should have asked questions about the staff turnover. I should have noticed that the position had been vacant for 6 months. I should have paid attention when the outgoing coordinator transferred me all her files and said, "Good luck. You're going to need it." I didn't pay attention. I was too excited about the opportunity. My first week at the Banff Springs was incredible. The hotel was even more magnificent in person than in photographs. Walking through the lobby felt like stepping into another era. Massive chandeliers hung from impossibly high ceilings. The grand staircase spiraled up in this haunting and beautiful way that made you understand why people came here to celebrate their most important moments. The staff was professional and welcoming. The guests were wealthy and pleasant. Everything was perfect, except for the ballroom. The ballroom was on the 3rd floor, in the oldest section of the hotel. It was a stunning space, with tall windows that looked out over the mountains, a polished wood dance floor, and chandeliers that sparkled like captured stars. We were planning to host 3 major events there over the next 3 months. Weddings, mostly, and 1 charity gala. The ballroom was going to be the centerpiece of our events calendar. But there was something unsettling about that room. I noticed it the first time I walked in alone. The air felt different, colder. There was this strange quality to the light, like it was being filtered through something invisible. My hands got goosebumps, and I couldn't explain why. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a beautiful old room in a beautiful old hotel. There was nothing scary or horrifying about it. There was no reason to feel this creeping sense of danger. That night, I settled into my staff apartment on the 4th floor. It was small but comfortable. A bedroom, a bathroom, a little kitchenette. The windows overlooked the parking lot and the mountains beyond. I unpacked my things, ordered room service, and tried to settle into my new routine. I was exhausted from the drive up from Calgary and the first day of orientation and meetings. I fell asleep around 10 o'clock. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of music. It was distant and muffled, like someone was playing a violin in another part of the hotel. Classical music, something that sounded like a waltz. Beautiful and elegant and deeply wrong. I checked my phone. 3:12 in the morning. I grabbed my robe and went out into the hallway to investigate. The music was coming from somewhere below me, echoing through the hotel's corridors. I followed it. I know that sounds stupid. In every horror movie, the character follows the terrifying noise, and it always ends badly. But I was half asleep and curious, and I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe a guest was having a private event. Maybe the hotel had live music scheduled for something I hadn't been informed about yet. I descended the staircase to the 3rd floor. The music was louder here, clearer. It was definitely coming from the ballroom. I walked down the hallway, my bare feet silent on the thick carpet, and I pushed open the ballroom doors. What I saw inside that room changed everything. She was dancing alone in the center of the ballroom, illuminated by the chandeliers that were somehow glowing despite being turned off. She was wearing a white wedding dress, the kind you wear in a 1940s film. The dress was beautiful, but also horrifying because it was torn and tattered and stained with something dark. Her hair was pinned up with flowers that looked like they were made of ash. And her face was ethereal and peaceful and absolutely, unmistakably dead. I am not being poetic. I am not exaggerating. The woman dancing in front of me was a ghost, a haunting specter, an eerie and terrifying manifestation of something that had died in this hotel decades ago. There was an unreal quality to her, like she wasn't quite solid. Like the light passed through her in a way that light shouldn't. And she was dancing to music that no living person was playing. I couldn't scream. My throat closed up. I couldn't move. I could only stand there in the doorway, watching this impossible thing happen before my eyes. The ghost bride continued her dance, spinning and swaying with grace and elegance, her movements fluid and precise. She didn't acknowledge me. She didn't seem to know I was there. She was lost in her own private dance, performing a waltz that would never end. And then, with no transition, no warning, she was gone. The music stopped. The ghost disappeared. The ballroom was empty and silent, and the chandeliers went dark. I was standing alone in a completely normal ballroom at 3 in the morning, and I couldn't tell if I had hallucinated the entire thing or if I had actually witnessed something from beyond the grave. I went back to my apartment and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done when I took this job. I researched the hotel, its history. I sat in the lobby with my coffee and I pulled up everything I could find about the Banff Springs on my laptop. And I found the story, the terrifying legend that everyone who works here apparently knows about. In 1926, a bride was married in the Banff Springs Hotel. She was young and beautiful, and this was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. During the reception, she was dancing in the ballroom, the same ballroom where I had just seen her ghost. And she was so caught up in the moment that she didn't watch her step. She fell down the stone staircase that connected the ballroom to the lower levels. She fell hard and fast and died from her injuries. Her wedding dress was torn and stained with blood. Her neck was broken. She died alone in the darkness of those stairs, and her wedding day became the day her life ended. And according to the eerie and creepy legend, she never left. She is still there. Still dancing? Still celebrating a wedding that ended in tragedy. Still trapped in that moment of joy and elegance and unsettling dread. The Ghost Bride, the most famous haunted presence in the Banff Springs Hotel. I told myself it had been a dream. I told myself that I had fallen asleep while researching and my mind had created an elaborate hallucination based on the information I had just absorbed. That was the logical explanation. That was what made sense. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen something real, something terrifying and horrifying that didn't fit into my comfortable, rational worldview. I tried to continue my job as if nothing had happened. I coordinated meetings with vendors. I confirmed dates with the couples who were getting married. I walked through the ballroom in daylight and it looked completely normal. Beautiful, even. There was nothing scary or eerie about it when the sun was shining through the windows and the regular staff were moving through the hotel. But every night, I heard the music. It started around 2:30 or 3 in the morning. A distant violin playing a waltz. The same haunting melody, night after night. Some nights it was louder than others. Some nights I could almost understand the words, as if a woman was singing along with the music, her voice hollow and echoing and profoundly sad. I started keeping my door locked. I turned up the volume on my television to drown out the sound. I bought earplugs and white noise machines. Nothing worked. The music found me no matter what I did. After 2 weeks of this, I started to notice something even more disturbing. Other staff members were acting strangely around me. They would catch me in hallways and ask me questions like, "Have you been going to the ballroom at night?" Or, "Are you hearing the music yet?" Or, most chillingly, "Has she shown you her face?" I asked one of the housekeeping staff, a woman named Marie who had worked at the hotel for 15 years, what they meant by that last question. Marie's face went pale. She looked around to make sure no one was listening, and then she pulled me into an empty guest room. "You've seen her," Marie said. "It wasn't a question." "I don't know what you mean," I lied. "Yes, you do. You've seen the ghost bride. And now you read part of this." Marie's hands were shaking. "Everyone who sees her starts hearing the music. And the music gets closer every night. And eventually, the music comes into your room." "That's not real," I said. But my voice was weak. "It's not possible." "I don't care if you believe me or not," Marie said. "But I'm telling you what I know. The previous event coordinator, the one before you, she lasted 3 months. Just like they always do. And on the last night of her 3rd month, the music came into her room. She was found in the morning, sitting on her bed, staring at nothing. They sent her to a hospital in Calgary. She still doesn't talk. She just sits there, completely catatonic, and sometimes you can hear her humming a waltz." The unsettling feeling in my stomach intensified. The creeping dread became something more concrete. I was living in a haunted hotel, and according to Marie, I had signed up for a 3-month contract that would end in psychological destruction. "What do I do?" I asked. "That's the terrifying part," Marie said. "There's nothing you do. She picks one person each season, and she dances for them until they break. Some people say she is lonely. Some people say she is angry that her wedding was ruined. Some people say she just needs a witness to what happened to her. But whatever the reason, once she is chosen you don't get to leave until she is done with you." I wanted to resign immediately. I wanted to pack up my things and drive back to Calgary and never return to this nightmare place. But the hotel contract had a clause. If I left early without completing my 3-month commitment, I would lose not just my salary but also have to pay a penalty equal to 1 month's wages. With my divorce and my rent payments and my student loans, I couldn't afford to lose that money. I was trapped, so I did something I had never done before. I went to the library in Banff and I started researching everything I could find about the ghost bride. I looked at old newspaper articles from 1926. I found a photograph of her wedding day, and I recognized the face immediately. It was the same face I had seen dancing in the ballroom. She had been a beautiful woman named Eleanor. She was only 23 years old when she died. I found her grave in the cemetery. It was marked with an angel statue, and the inscription read, "Eleanor Margaret Ashford, beloved daughter, forever young, forever a bride." Standing at that grave, reading those words, I felt something shift. The terrifying mystery started to take on the shape of real tragedy. Eleanor hadn't been a ghost trying to hurt people. She had been a young woman whose life was cut short on what was supposed to be her happiest day. She was trapped in this hotel, repeating the same dance, the same moment, over and over for nearly a century. That night, when I heard the music beginning around 2 in the morning, I made a decision that looking back seems insane but felt necessary at the time. I got out of bed. I put on a nice dress, the nicest one I had brought with me. I brushed my hair, I put on makeup, and I walked to the ballroom. The ghost bride was there, dancing as she always was. The chandeliers were glowing with that strange, eerie light. The music was coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. And this time, she noticed me. She stopped dancing. She turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw her face up close. It was translucent and sad and desperate in a way that broke my heart. She had been dancing alone for 97 years. She had been repeating her wedding dance without a partner, without witness, without any acknowledgement of her tragedy. She had been forgotten by the living, reduced to a legend, a scary story that hotel staff told to scare each other. I walked into the center of the ballroom. The ghost bride watched me approach, and then she reached out her translucent hand toward me. Her fingers passed through my arm, and I felt a shock of cold that was bone deep and profound. It hurt, but it also felt like something else. It felt like connection, like recognition, like being truly seen by another person after a long, long time. I raised my hand to hers, and we began to dance. I don't know how long we danced. Time felt different in that ballroom, stretched and strange. The music played, and we moved together, and I was dancing with a ghost, which sounds impossible and horrifying and completely terrifying. But it didn't didn't feel evil. It felt like grief. It felt like loneliness. It felt like a young woman who had never gotten to finish her wedding day, trying to complete something that had been interrupted by tragedy and death. When the music finally stopped, Eleanor slowly faded away. But before she disappeared completely, she smiled at me. It was a real smile, not haunted or eerie or threatening. It was the smile of a young woman who had finally gotten to dance with someone who acknowledged her existence. I went back to my apartment and I slept without nightmares for the first time since arriving at the hotel. The next morning, everything was different. The music still came at night, but it didn't sound as unsettling. The ballroom still felt cold when I walked through it, but it felt like a calm cold, not a threatening cold. And I started to understand what Eleanor needed. She needed to be seen. She needed to be remembered. She needed someone to acknowledge that her life had mattered, even though it had ended too soon. Every night for the rest of my contract, I would go to the ballroom around 2:30 in the morning. And every night, Eleanor would be there, waiting. We would dance to the haunting waltz, and I would hold her translucent hand. And for those moments, neither of us was alone. She wasn't forgotten. She wasn't just a legend to scare the hotel staff. She was Eleanor, a young woman who had loved and married and deserved to be remembered as more than just a ghost. On my last night at the hotel, Eleanor danced differently. There was something peaceful about her movements, something that suggested closure or acceptance or the easing of a burden that had been carried too long. When we finished our final dance, she reached up and touched my cheek. Her hand was cold, but not unpleasant. It was like being touched by winter wind, by something natural and old and not inherently evil. She whispered something to me. It was barely audible, a sound like wind moving through ancient trees, but I understood what she said. "Thank you for dancing with me." And then she was gone. Not just faded, but truly gone, released from whatever unseen force had kept her trapped in that ballroom for nearly a century. I stood alone in the empty space, and I knew that she was finally at peace. I left the Banff Springs Hotel the next morning. The staff seemed relieved to see me go, which made sense because they thought I would end up like my predecessor, catatonic and traumatized. Marie pulled me aside before I left and asked me what had happened. I told her the truth, and she actually looked relieved. "She finally let one of you go," Marie said. "In 15 years, I've never seen that happen before. I've been back in Calgary for 3 months now, and I still think about Eleanor every day. I still hear the waltz sometimes, late at night, and I wonder if other people in other hotels are hearing it too. I wonder if there are other ghosts, other tragic stories, other people trapped between life and death who are waiting for someone to dance with them. But mostly, I'm grateful that I was able to give Eleanor something she needed. Grateful that I was strong enough to face the fear and the darkness and the unsettling uncertainty instead of running away. And grateful that I learned something that most people never discover, that the most terrifying things in life are often the most human. So here, it's my question for you, listener. If you encountered a real ghost, a genuine haunting that couldn't be explained away or rationalized, would you run away in fear, or would you try to understand what the ghost needed from you? Write your answer in the comments. I want to know what you would do.